Good morning, Little Masters, and welcome back to today's Tolkien Times. I'm the Man of the West, also from the Prancing Pony podcast. Let's keep week 34 going with today's Third Age Thursday. It's our time to revisit the familiar and not so familiar stories of the Third Age. This time, it's definitely the familiar. I plan on spending at least the next 8 weeks feasting, opening birthday presents, and rubbing elbows with all the best hobbits in the Shire as I enjoy a long-expected party. When Mr. Bilbo Baggins of Bag End announced that he would shortly be celebrating his 111st birthday with a party of special magnificence, there was much talk and excitement in Hobbiton. Bilbo was very rich and very peculiar, and had been the wonder of the Shire for 60 years, ever since his remarkable disappearance, an unexpected return. The riches he had brought back from his travels had now become a local legend, and it was popularly believed, whatever the old folk might say, that the hill at Bag End was full of tunnels stuffed with treasure. And if that was not enough for fame, there was also his prolonged vigor to marvel at. Time wore on, but it seemed to have little effect on Mr. Baggins. At 90, he was much the same as at 50. At 99, they began to call him well-preserved, but unchanged would have been nearer the mark. There were some that shook their heads and thought this was too much of a good thing. It seemed unfair that anyone should possess apparently perpetual youth, as well as reputedly inexhaustible wealth. "It will have to be paid for," they said. "It isn't natural, and trouble will come of it." But so far trouble had not come. And as Mr. Baggins was generous with his money, most people were willing to forgive him his oddities and his good fortune. He remained on visiting terms with his relatives, except, of course, the Sackville Bagginses, and he had many devoted admirers among the hobbits of poor and unimportant families. But he had no close friends until some of his younger cousins began to grow up. The eldest of these, and Bilbo's favorite, was young Frodo Baggins. When Bilbo was 99, he adopted Frodo as his heir and brought him to live at Bag End, and the hopes of the Sackville Bagginses were finally dashed. Bilbo and Frodo happened to have the same birthday, September 22nd. "You had better come and live here, Frodo, my lad," said Bilbo one day, "and then we can celebrate our birthday parties comfortably together." At that time, Frodo was still in his tweens, as the hobbits called the irresponsible 20s between childhood and coming of age at 33. 12 more years passed. Each year, the Bagginses had given very lively combined birthday parties at Bag End. But now it was understood that something quite exceptional was being planned for that autumn. Bilbo was going to be 111, a very curious number and a very respectable age for a hobbit. The old Took himself had only reached 130. And Frodo was going to be 33, an important number, the date of his coming of age. Tongues began to wag in Hobbiton and Bywater, and rumor of the coming event traveled all over the Shire. The history and character of Mr. Bilbo Baggins became once again the chief topic of conversation, and the older folk suddenly found their reminiscences in welcome demand. No one had a more attentive audience than old Ham Gamgee, commonly known as the Gaffer. He held forth at the Ivy Bush, a small inn on the Bywater Road, and he spoke with some authority, for he had tended the garden at Bag End for 40 years, and had helped old Holman in the same job before that. Now that he was himself growing old and stiff in the joints, the job was mainly carried on by his youngest son, Sam Gamgee. Both father and son were on very friendly terms with Bilbo and Frodo. They lived on the hill itself, in number 3 Bagshot Row, just below Bag End. "A very nice, well-spoken, gentle hobbit is Mr. Bilbo, as I've always said," the Gaffer declared. With perfect truth, for Bilbo was very polite to him, calling him Master Hamfast, and consulting him constantly upon the growing of vegetables. In the matter of roots, especially potatoes, the Gaffer was recognized as the leading authority by all in the neighborhood, including himself. "Or what about this Frodo that lives with him?" asked old Noakes of Bywater. "Baggins is his name, and he's more than half a brandybuck, they say. Beats me why any Baggins of Hobbiton should go looking for a wife away there in Buckland, where folks are so queer."
"And no wonder they're queer,"
put in Daddy Two-Foot. the gaffer's next-door neighbor. "If they live on the wrong side of the Brandywine River, right again the old forest, that's a dark, bad place if half the tales be true." "You're right, Dad," said the gaffer. "Not that the Brandybucks of Buckland live in the old forest, but they're a queer breed, seemingly. They fool about with boats on that big river, and that isn't natural. Small wonder the trouble came of it, I say. But be that as it may, Mr. Frodo is as nice a young hobbit as you could wish to meet. Very much like Mr. Bilbo, and in more than looks. After all, his father was a Baggins. A decent, respectable hobbit was Mr. Drogo Baggins. There was never much to tell of him till he was drowned." "Drowned," said several voices. They'd heard this and other darker rumors before, of course, but hobbits have a passion for family history, and they were ready to hear it again. This passage feels like coming home. The opening chapters of Fellowship, but especially A Long Expected Party, are comfort reads. They're just like warm and cozy big hugs, and I can't wait to read more. But for now, I just want to remind you of a few things about the stuff we just read. At first, you already know about Baggins and Bag End and even the Sackville Bagginses, and a little of the word nerdery behind them after yesterday's episode. I also wanted to touch on Bilbo's adoption of Frodo. The text tells us Bilbo was 99 when he adopted Frodo. Frodo wasn't born until Bilbo was 78, and was himself only 12 when his parents tragically drowned, as the gaffer begins to tell the story. 9 years later, at age 21, he goes to live with Bilbo, and then he's 33 at the party, and then 51 when he leaves the Shire himself. There's also this bit about 111, or 11, being a respectable age, and the mention of the old Took reaching 130. In letter number 131, the famous letter to Milton Waldman, Tolkien writes of The Lord of the Rings that it begins with a chapter, somewhat similar in style, that in title, A Long Expected Party, and content is a deliberate parallel to the first chapter of the earlier book. Bilbo is now 111 years old age for a hobbit. Now, the footnote to that passage reads, "The normal span of hobbits is represented as being roughly in the proportion of 100 to our 80. Now, that fits. It would make 111 relatively rare, the equivalent of nearly 89, and it would make 130 equivalent to 104. Now, only a very small percentage of the population reaches that. It's about 1 in 25,000, which is 4 100,000ths of 1%. It also makes the hobbit coming of age at 33 equivalent to about 26 and a half years old. I have no comment to add to that. Folks, thank you for joining me for this week's Third Age Thursday. Come back next week as we hear the wild conspiracy theories behind the drowning of Drogo Baggins and his wife Primula, not to mention the rumors of the apparently inexhaustible wealth of Baggins. Check out patreon.com/Tolkien Times to learn how you can support the show, because we don't have inexhaustible wealth. You can get an ad-free feed there, join my content council, get a bonus episode every week, and a whole lot more. And join me again tomorrow on today's Tolkien Times as we try something new this series on Fridays. If you're watching this on YouTube, please like and subscribe, and please follow or subscribe in your podcast apps, and follow @Tolkien Times on all your social media. Finally, as Faramir says, go with the goodwill of all good men.